Well, it's another Sunday morning. It's so good to be back with everybody. I I don't know why I feel the need to perpetuate the fiction that it's Sunday morning, but I'm more comfortable with that in leading the discussion. Um, we are continuing a study of Titus. It is exciting for me because tonight on Tuesday night I'm in my new office at work. Uh, my best friend, he left my firm and went to work for a rival firm, and my consolation prize was I got a bigger office. It's not worth it. I would gladly take him back. I think all of us can agree that friendship is far superior to larger offices, but that is the reality of the professional world. And so I'm a bit in mourning. But that being said, I'm sure through our discussion of Titus, you guys will cheer me up, and I'll be much happier by the time we're done. Okay, just to catch everybody up, we have had 3 weeks to get through 9 verses in Titus chapter 1. Now, they were chock full of the elder stuff. So, we spent a lot of time in there, and everybody had opinions. And so that expanded the time out. Today, we're finally going to get to talk a little bit about the Judaizers and the legalism that I've been promising everybody for 3 weeks before today. So I've got Johnny and Paul and Alberto with me. So we're going to have some discussion. But before we get into that discussion, Johnny, do you mind reading Titus chapter 1, verse 10 through 16?
Yes, sir. For there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things which they ought not, for the sake of dishonest gain. One of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretians are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true. Therefore, rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but even their mind and conscience are defiled. They profess to know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable, disobedient, and disqualified for every good work.
Okay. Titus has been given a job by Paul, and it's to clean up town. He's the new marshal in town, and he's coming in to clean it up. And part of that process was the appointment of elders, and the elders are supposed to help Titus deal with the problem they were having. And that problem, as Johnny read, was related to these rebellious people full of meaningless talk and deception. And then especially those of the circumcision group. That's the ones we've been calling the Judaizers. Now, in our world today, we don't deal with Judaizers a whole lot, but we definitely deal with their equivalents. What would be the modern day equivalent of a Judaizer?
Not to say that is, wrong or bad, but one example that comes to mind is if you're not baptized, you cannot partake of the Lord's Supper, right?
Okay.
So that's something that we traditionally done, and there are reasons for it, but I can see how you might throw somebody for a loop if they don't know and they reach in the plate and you're like, wait, hold on now. You haven't gone through the proper steps. You're not allowed to be part of that.
Okay. And I want to circle back around to that because that comes in really heavy in one of the points that I want to make. To unpack what you said, I think what you're talking about is people that are guided more by the rules than maybe by grace. in the way they attack any problem or any issue that they see. They're always guided by the rules as opposed to grace. So what is the kind of catch-all term that we use to describe people that are ruled by the law and not by grace necessarily?
The one that comes to my mind should not be and publicly put out. So I'm going to pass on this one.
Okay.
Yeah,
Paul?
I'm not sure I know the name for it, but to me, anyone that says that grace is insufficient to save you, you got to do something else besides accept the grace offered by Christ. Then you're defeating Christ. You're saying Christ is not sufficient. And so to me, anything on top of that for your salvation is, grace plus anything else to be saved is nothing. It's either grace saves you or it doesn't. Make up
your mind
wrong. What it is.
Okay. Look, I think I made the question too hard on some level, because all I was looking for was legalist. You're a legalist. If you're stressing the law over the power of grace and the sufficiency of grace, to use Paul's terminology. This kind of feeds into what Alberto was talking about a few moments ago. But if an unbeliever comes to you and says, how do I get right? How do I get in a right relationship with God? Now, I'm saying an unbeliever comes to you and says, how do I get in a right relationship with God? And how would for example, a legalist, how would a legalist respond to that question? If they were asked, how do you get right with the Lord? A non-believer, what are they going to immediately set out for that person?
Sign them up for Bible class.
Okay. They'll say, okay, number one, go to church. That's the first thing. Number two, abstain from evil. Be generous with your money. Partake of the Lord's Supper every Sunday. All this kind of, their first response is a series of deeds, a series of works, a series of check marks that you satisfy. And really, what is the message that we have to the lost? What is the message that we are supposed to give the lost?
Well, it's certainly not checkbox religion. I would say it's a whole lot more about God's grace and forgiveness and our acknowledgement of our shortcomings and profession of faith.
It's the gospel, right? I mean, it's the good news. It's that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who was in heaven with God, humbled himself to come to earth and to die for a people who had sinned when he himself hadn't sinned, in order that they might be saved, that there might be a reconciliation between you, the sinner, and God. And, there's justification and there's sanctification. And, one of the challenges that I think legalists face, and one of the mistakes they always make, is they put the sanctification before the justification, and they get focused on, you need to do this, and this right, and then you can be a Christian, right? Instead of recognizing that all you need is to come to God. Yep. You need to, you come to God, and God does the rest. And look, we could get into the details and get lost and bogged down in the minutia of it and talk about baptism and the acts of salvation and the steps of salvation and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, what we as Christians have received is a gift, where all we did was come to God and God did the rest. Jesus did the rest. I'm still old school a lot of times, and I lead with God, because in my head, God the Father, Jesus the Son, and I fall into the hierarchical.
I agree with you, Jason, in that people in their, what's the right word? In their fear, I guess. I don't know. Maybe fear is the right word. I'm not quite sure. There's so many people that are terrified of making a mistake and believe that I can make this mistake and God will no longer save me, that I'm no longer worthy of being saved. Well, you were never worthy of being saved. He loves you. He made a way for you to be saved through the substitutionary death of his son, the grace that comes from that sacrifice, and then the new life that's in Christ, and the Holy Spirit coming into your life. And the Holy Spirit's that's where the conversion happens. That's where your life changes. It's not going to happen like that. It's a journey. I think all of us are, at my age, I'm still on the journey. I'll be on the journey till the day I die. Is sin out there? Does your body still want to participate in sin? Yes, it does. Will you slip? Yes, you will. But you'll sin less. You'll feel worse for it, and you're going to ask for forgiveness, and you're going to get back up and say, "Let's start over, Lord." That's David. He has the heart of the Lord. That's exactly the example that he has. He's screwed up a lot, but every time he did, he admitted it. He said, let's go again. And God said, let's go, David. I'll be with you. So we get the cart before the horse. And sometimes the cart that we have is a cart that no horse in the world could ever pull.
And
legalism.
When we look at good teaching, good writing, whatever, you have to consider your audience. And these people weren't learned religious scholars he was writing to, so we can complicate it and burden it down so much instead of just taking the simple, unvarnished truth about God's love and acknowledgement of our sins and faith in him. And you can put a lot more on it, but you got to get to that first. That's the core. And so you keep it simple for the people who are just trying to learn this. Don't burden them down with all of the rules.
And in the case of Crete, what was it that the legalists were trying to make the Cretans do? What was the additional layers they were putting on there and saying God's not sufficient, Christ isn't sufficient?
They were, the classic Judaizer was saying, okay, for you men, you have to be circumcised. And then for all of you, you've got to take on the dietary laws. You got to take on the cleanliness laws. You've got to observe all the festivals, all the feasts, all the fasts, all the sacrifices, all the things that are part of Judaism that they all cherished. So Christ plus this, now you're really a Christian. That's what they were peddling. And it was obviously a fight for many decades in the first century. Paul dealt with it early on. In Acts 15, you have the Jerusalem Council, and Peter stands up and says, "Hey, our people never could deal with this yoke, but yet you want to put this yoke on them? That's not right." And so they went through. He says, "We're saved by grace alone." That's what Peter says, and then James writes the letter, and he goes back to him, and it's pretty simple. Don't listen to these Judaizers. Abstain from these things, and get on with your life.
Well, it's exactly what you're saying. I mean, Colossians chapter 2 talks about how we're made complete through Christ. And in saying that complete, they're saying whole. And so that complete there is sometimes translated kind of similar to perfect. We're saved through Christ. We are made complete, whole again through Christ. One of my favorite verses is in Galatians chapter 2 in relationship to this issue. But it's when Paul and Peter were having their squabble over this, where Peter was like, you live like a Gentile, but you're acting like you're making everybody else live like a Jew. You're making the Gentiles live like a Jew. But there's a verse, I almost said a line because it's like a movie, but Paul says in verse 18, he says, if I rebuild what I destroyed, then I really would be a lawbreaker. Talking about how the law was fulfilled in Christ and it ended. It was done. It was fulfilled. And if you go and bring it back, you are, you're the lawbreaker by taking something that's already been fulfilled, already been made complete and done, but trying to bring it back. You're actually breaking the law that you're trying to restore, because you're not living into its purpose. That's right before Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, which is the famous song we all sang when we were kids. Well, I sang when I was kids. We're varied ages here. Maybe you guys didn't sing it, but I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. This idea of being crucified with Christ. There's the Judaizers were essentially, you had used the word fear earlier. I see the Judaizers being motivated by jealousy. They didn't like, I think the Judaizers struggled with the idea that it was that simple, that it was that easy. They were like, we had learned these ceremonies. We've done the circumcision. We've put in years and years and years of building this righteous law abiding existence. And now you're telling me all I need is grace.
Yeah.
And there's a certain anger there, Alberto.
And y'all feel free to correct me if what I'm about to say is, way out there. But most of these things that the Judaizers were wanting these people to do were things that were commanded directly to them, right? Because at this time, these are Israel, right? So God made a covenant with Israel, walking them through ages. They fell apart. He forgave them again. They came back to him. Things for them to remember where they came from, right? Being rescued from Egypt and all that. And here are they trying to get these people to go through the same thing they did, even though some of these people might not even be part of what you would consider Jews, right? So to me, I don't know if we have something that we can compare today, like what is something that has been not required, but called out from God to us that we're trying to put on other people as well. Maybe it's not the same thing, right? But, I can see how, like you're saying, Jason, like for them, it's like, well, we've been doing X, Y, and Z for many years. There's no way these people can just, have it come in and roll with it, right? Why can't they go through what we went through as well? So,
Well, we've got, we have traditions. Every group has their traditions, and unfortunately, and Jason said it well in the opening, that we kind of tend toward legalism in the Church of Christ, and that's because of traditions. We put our traditions in the format of being doctrine, and the doctrine is a requirement to be saved. And that's where you go off the rails. And that's where they went off the rails. They were trying to put their tradition, saying, you've got to have this tradition, do the same work that we've done in order to be saved. And Paul's saying, no. Peter said no. James says no. Those are your, and John says no. Those are your four writers of the New Testament. After the three synoptics plus John Gospels. Of course, Luke writes, Acts and Luke. He's the only non-Jewish writer in the whole Bible. And so, these guys are telling you it's grace, but there's folks coming back in and saying, no, it's the tradition. That is what makes, that plus the tradition is what makes you complete.
Yeah. And I think, to go back to what you said, Alberto, the Jews, they had lived under the covenant. They under the old covenant. They had been required to do a lot of those things as part of their service to the Lord. And what they weren't recognizing was that there was a new covenant, that covenant had been leading them to a place, which is what they should have been happy about. They should have been excited that they were getting to see the fulfillment of the law in their lifetime. But instead, like I said, I think it was hard for some of them because they focused on what they had done and what they had given up in their mind, and they wanted other people to have that experience if they were going to get to the same place. And that's the thing I think we get the equivalency of today a lot of times is you get old school Christians, people that have been serving the Lord for a long time, and they have trained and disciplined themselves, and they view themselves as very, very good at avoiding sin. And they see somebody else who seems to screw up all the time, who seems to stumble constantly, make mistakes, misunderstand stuff. And those people are just as saved as they are. And that there seems to be an inequity in that, in your mind. And in that, from that inequity springs the jealousy and the desire to have legalism and say, hey, look, I'm doing X and this guy's doing X minus J and K and M and N, and he's nowhere near me. So we need to make him as good as me to get him into heaven. And that is just such a corruption of what we're called to be as Christians. And I think that motivates a lot of our legalism today. I could be wrong in that regard, but I do think it motivates a lot of our legalism today, much like it did the Jews with their rituals.
I think going back to keeping it simple, which is what Aggies need to do, and not, Paul anticipated this kind of problem. In what I read, he spoke out about some of those poor behaviors, but then he got kind of through that and went and said, look, this is what you look for. And he actually broke it down by age and gender and free and slave. And he gave sort of a list, a set of adjectives for characteristics. And they didn't include tradition follower and rule follower and those things. They had other very appropriate God-like efforts for the people. And I think that's proof positive. He's outlining what needs to happen to this new collection of people, and he gave Titus that as not a job classification so much as just a checklist. These are the things to aspire to, and they don't include a lot of that legalism stuff at all.
No, you're absolutely right. And next week we're going to get into chapter 2, and when he starts talking about what the appropriate things to teach people are, it's not following the law. It's a good behavior. It's very different from maybe what we tend to focus on in the church a lot of times. And I think that's a problem. Yeah. Paul.
Can I throw a statistic that's, unfortunately true? I just pulled the group here. During most people's life in Christ, what are their most productive years in terms of sharing the gospel message with others?
I'm going to say very young or very old.
Newly converts.
And I'm kind of with Johnny. What'd you say, Alberto? I didn't catch it.
I said like new converts, right? Like excited. Yeah.
Yeah, the first 2 years. Mm-hmm. Because after 2 years, we get institutionalized. Mm-hmm. And we're not sharing the gospel anymore. And that's a big part of our issues is we forgot why we're here. We're here to help people come to Christ and be saved. And we get into, we like the fact that we don't have musical instruments in our church, so that makes us better than those guys. that's institutionalized. You're being institutionalized. You've lost sight of the real reason why we're here. We're here to be salt and light.
Yeah, we tend to lead with our church traditions instead of leading with the gospel, right? I mean, we tend to want to make them Church of Christ people before we make them Christians. And that is a tragic mistake that has hurt a lot of people and actually driven people away from the church in the past, and is something that we're still occasionally paying the price for.
Well, it's not just Church of Christ. It's every group. Everybody does the same thing, and some of them have taken it to, you know people as well as I do that are in different groups, and they're at very, very extreme limits. They think Church of Christ is at extreme limits, but the problem for all of them is you're no longer sharing the good news of Jesus Christ and the salvation that comes only through him and the gift of grace that only he can offer you.
Absolutely. And, when I talk about that, I grew up in Oklahoma, and the Church of Christ had a very strong presence, and it wasn't uncommon for us to spend a lot of time arguing with other church people. It wasn't about the saved and the unsaved. It was about Baptist versus Church of Christ, or Pentecostal versus Church of Christ. And I think on some level, that's a losing battle, because again, we're not reaching the audience that we're wanting to reach, which is the lost. And instead, like Paul's saying, we're worried about institutionalizing them, indoctrinating them into our traditions, as opposed to actually introducing them to God in the gospel and that good news that exists. It's kind of interesting. Titus is told, rebuke them sharply so they will be sound in the faith, and pay no attention to Jewish myths or to merely human commands of those who reject the truth. One of the things that I always am concerned about is we have an accountability to each other. We have a responsibility to each other. And when we see somebody going down the wrong path, we have a responsibility to them. And it's not to beat them down, but it is to, like he said, he's rebuking them sharply so they will be sound in the faith. It's not to divide them from the church. It's to bring them to the church. And so often we spend so much time telling people what they aren't, that they don't realize what they are, which is a child of God, somebody who God cares very much about. And if we get too heavily focused, especially with a new Christian or somebody who's a non-believer, we get so focused with what they're doing wrong that it kind of kills them on the vine. And that speaks to what you were talking about earlier, Alberto. Somebody's new to the church, and the communion's being passed, and they've got 5 kids, and you see all 5 kids, they're grabbing 2, they're doing the 2-fisted thing. And I have seen people react to that with shock and dismay, and intervention. And it hasn't always come from a loving place. It's come more from an, I'm insulted or an outraged place. And I think that when we think about our obligation to each other, we need to approach each other with love, with this idea that we are all trying to become what they said here, which is sound in the faith, and it's a process. You're not just born that way, right? I mean, you're not just all of a sudden a fully mature Christian. Go ahead, Alberto.
And I think on the flip side as well, Jason, we tend not to rebuke people sharply. And that's because we haven't formed the appropriate relationship with that person, right? So like if you are solid with somebody, you're friends, you know about each other, you care deeply for each other, it's easy. Hopefully you have a relationship where you can rebuke when you see them doing something, and lovingly you reach out to them. But because oftentimes we have a very superficial relationship, we see it and we're like, I should say something, but I'm not going to, because I don't know how that person is going to take it. And not that I'm saying, it's my duty to be the judge and point people's issues, right? But I think if that relationship is there, those kind of things would happen more, often and easily, because the other party will receive it as like, yes, because you love me, you see me doing something, shady, you're reaching out and calling me to it. So
yeah, 100%. Look, the church discipline that's talked about, like in 1 Corinthians, the only way that really works is if we do develop those intimate relationships with each other, if we do have that love for each other, because otherwise it's meaningless to the person. It has no impact whatsoever. Or it comes off as hypocrites and self-righteous people who are just, again, trying to embarrass somebody or do something along those lines. So, yeah, no, look, I am a huge proponent, and it's something that I struggle with. But I'm a huge proponent of intimacy in the church. We cannot be a series of cliques that meet inside the same building, and occasionally bump against each other or rub against each other. If we're truly a family, it's going to be intergenerational. It's going to be up and down and horizontal. It's going to be an integration where we are all interacting with each other on some level. Now, we're not going to have intimate relationships with everybody in the church, but we have to have relationships where that intimacy is just outside the people that we can touch. It has to be something that we grow with. It's not always a popular concept in the Church of Christ, but I'm a big fan of testimonials and witnessing from this standpoint. You share in that process, you share something of yourself. You are revealing a portion of who you are, and you are bearing yourself naked to the world and letting them see who you really are. You take the mask off and you say, this is who I am. And this is how this experience helped me to grow with the Lord. Or this is how I reached bottom, and this person here was able to help lift me up, through God and by sharing the gospel, or whatever that may be. You are bearing yourself. And I think that's how we create the intimacy in the church. You make people, you share of yourself so that each person that hears has a part of you that they wouldn't have under normal circumstances. And I think that's what allows that rebuking to work, and help it be a positive thing and not a negative thing. Just my thoughts. Anybody got a comment on that?
The most important, the most impactful teachers are not the ones that have the greatest content knowledge. They have the ability to have a connection with their people and their students, whatever that may be, the adult learner or whoever. But the bottom line is, sometimes you have to acknowledge and express your own vulnerability, because if you appear to always have all the answers and always be in charge and always be right, what does that do to somebody who's trying to learn? This is focusing on new Christians, babies in the faith, and you can't be a 50-year veteran and expect them to be there. You got to go to where they are, and you do that by being approachable and by being humble and by being honest about your own struggles. Because that's a lot more impactful than saying, be like me, I'm perfect. But that's a lie anyway.
You know, I'm a huge sports fan, and lots of times the greatest baseball players, the greatest football players, the greatest basketball players, they don't make great coaches because they are not relatable. Their brilliance, their genius made them the best at what they do. So when a player on their team's struggling, they don't know what to tell them because they didn't have that experience. They just had more talent. They just had more ability. So they're not always able to translate those things. That's why you see guys like, Tony La Russa, Tommy Lasorda in baseball, Whitey Herzog. You don't see these superstars become managers and coaches. Instead, you see these guys who struggle just to make it to the league, and they become the best managers. And it's because they're relatable. And I think a lot of times the Christians that can help the most with those who are maturing as Christians are those that struggle and continue to struggle. That vulnerability makes them more real to their audience a lot of times.
And I think that's got value also as you get, in the discussion that we're having right now about legalism. I think all of us have struggled with it. Some of us, I'm just talking about if you look at our 400 plus people across the board that have been at this for a while, everyone struggled with it. But the testimony of how you said, you know what, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to be doing this. And then again, your story on your walk through it, because, Jason, you and I both come from extremely conservative Church of Christ backgrounds, extremely conservative. And, I meet with a bunch of guys on Thursday mornings up here in my neighborhood, and we're from every kind of group you can think of. And I guess 3 years ago, we studied Revelations for a year, and I taught Revelation on Wednesday night in the men's class for a year, because I just did it side by side. Then did Daniel this past year. And, in Church of Christ, we never talk about end times, ever. Never. And if Jesus can talk about end times, we can too, but we don't. Why? And so right now I talk about it a lot because I feel like I have the freedom to discuss it. Most people look at me like I'm crazy, but you know what? I don't really care. I say let's look at what the Bible has to say about it. Oh, I don't want to do that. Why not? Well, we've never heard it before, so it can't be true. Well, if the Bible is the inerrant word of God, then it's true. Well, we're not going to talk about that. Oh, okay. Be that as it may, but people if they want to shackle themselves, they're going to shackle themselves. But all you can do is, I'm always looking for the folks that are, saying, hey, I know those guys you want to talk about, but I'd like to talk about that for a few minutes. Sure, what do you want to talk about? Well, where are you finding this stuff? Let's look. And you start working through it with them. And that's exciting. And so I don't think there's any general blanket thing that you can do in your walk, but if you can be salt and light along the way, there's going to be some people that are going to benefit from that and become stronger in their faith and a better sharer of the good news because of it. My 2 cents.
No, and as you were talking, everybody hears things through their own filter, right? And one of the things that immediately popped to my mind is the hardest thing about legalism when it gets a hold of you and when you are trying to get right is the need to admit you're wrong and the ability to admit you're wrong. And that is, I think that's so hard when you're in legalism. I mean, when I look at, growing up in the conservative Church of Christ, like you talked about, Paul, I look at the Pharisees and I'm so sympathetic to them And it's horrible to say that, but I am, because I understand. I mean, these guys had studied the word. They had peeled the layers back, and they were looking for the answers. They wanted to understand what was the most right thing to do. And it wasn't always to prove other people wrong. Lots of times it was motivated by a desire to understand the truth.
They
And
want to be right.
absolutely, absolutely. And that, generally speaking, that doesn't seem like a bad thing. But it's so hard when your desires to be right to ever admit you're wrong. When that is your preeminent desire, it's so hard to admit that you're wrong. And that's the problem we run into with legalism in the church today, is we never want to have that moment where we admit we're wrong. And we want to be right more than we care about salvation. We care about being saved a lot of times. And that's a scary place to be. And I think that's on some level what verse 15 is talking about. It says, to the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are corrupted and do not believe, nothing is pure. In fact, both their minds and consciences are corrupted. You know, the Pharisees found themselves in a position where their study was driven by the desire to be right, which meant anybody else was wrong. And so they constantly approached the world from the standpoint of finding what's wrong, finding the things that are it's kind of like if you're a hammer, everything you see is a nail. If you are always driven by finding what's right, you're always seeing what's wrong, and you're constantly looking at the world through that filter. And I think what you end up doing is you end up creating bindings that just don't exist. And you become, you corrupt everything in those situations. You start to see, instead of seeing the meat, you see something that was sacrificed to idols, to relate it to, 1 Corinthians. Instead of seeing a kind act, you see somebody who Alberto, to use your example again, in seeing the kids drink the fruit of the vine out of the thing, instead of seeing somebody whose desire is to be a part of the worship, you see somebody who's doing it wrong, and so there is a tendency when you fall into the legalist trap, everything becomes the right or wrong, and most of it's wrong, and you corrupt a lot of things that are not corrupt. And I just worry that there's that balance that has to be walked. Before we started class, I talked about, I think we walked that line between legalism and the antinomians, the ones who live where there's, a free license. You can do whatever you want, versus the legalists who are, constantly trying to bind you down into law. And I think inside the church, we bounce between those things. And historically in the Church of Christ, we've been more zealous in opposing the free license than we have the legalism. And sometimes we even embrace the legalism. But in doing that, we corrupt things that are not corrupt. And we bind ourselves in things that may not be things that God ever intended us to be bound on.
It's interesting with my three colleagues here. All of you are in industries that require a great deal of precision and accuracy. I mean, the law has to be a very difficult thing for you to try to balance sometimes with what's right and wrong as it relates to this conversation. Paul took care of people's safety engineering issues so nobody got killed. Alberto's got to do code and make it all exactly right. And all of those that move towards those strict adherence to guidelines, that's you do that all day, it's pretty tough to shift gears and go to this other perspective, I think, sometimes. So I admire all of you in terms of your efforts to be better at that. You know, senior college prof, you can get away with most anything. You can be a little more loosey goosey, and it doesn't make any difference. But it does create dissonance in your life when you're one thing in your profession and another thing in your faith. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but it sure makes it harder.
We're almost out of time. Let me hit verse 16. They claim to know God, but by their actions they deny him. They are detestable, disobedient, and unfit for doing anything good. It's kind of one of those situations. Tell me what you're really thinking, Paul. He's harsh with them, right? But the beauty of it is they were claiming to better know God, you needed to do these things like we do. Okay. And they were saying to be saved, to be with God, you have to do these things. But in making that statement, they were denying the power of the blood of Christ. They were denying the grace. They were denying that Christ was sufficient to save people, because they were adding this extra layer of things that you have to do in order to be saved. And you can tell, I mean, all you have to do is read everything Paul ever wrote. That bugged Paul a lot. It was one of the biggest things he fought against consistently in his teachings. And he touches on it here again, and he uses the word that people who are putting these bindings on people that are not put there by God, he's saying they're detestable, disobedient, and unfit for doing anything good. And I'm sorry, that is not something I would ever want to be said about me. And so I just encourage us as we go out into our life outside of this Bible class, that we take a moment and we engage in self-check. We engage in self-evaluation and try to identify those areas where we might be making the road more difficult for those around us by our preferences, by our traditions, by our and it is preferences on some level. It is preferences on some level. How are we using what we want to possibly put stumbling blocks in front of other people? And I think that's ultimately what legalism is. And we just need to be careful in that regard. And, you know, next week we're going to read what Titus was told to tell the various people at different stages, different places in the church, what they needed to do to be the best versions of themselves. And it's amazing to me because none of it is, as Johnny pointed out, it's not law. It's not law abiding stuff. It's different. It's more about attitude and orientation and those types of things, as opposed to, you know, what we generally associate with being a good Christian, you know, the law abiding part. Okay. I really appreciate it, guys. Thank you all for being here. We are over time. So see y'all next week.